of clinical realities. And I hope that in the course of my explanations it will become clear what I mean by this. In self-defense, let me mention first of all that by training I am a Jungian analyst. I was trained at the Jung Institute in Zurich about 100 years ago, from 50 to 53, training analysis and so on. So don't think I haven't heard about the unconscious or, the importance of the past and all of that. I have heard about that, yes. The trouble was only that when I left the Jung Institute, I knew almost everything about Siberian creation myths, but I didn't know what to do with a person who chewed his fingernails, and that sort of bothered me. And then, thank God, 7 years later, I ran into Gregory Bateson and his work, and that totally changed my outlook. Anyway, let me start out with a story, an Oriental story. It's called Setting Out. It's about a father who was riding a donkey with his young son walking beside him. It was a very hot day, and they had a long way to go. As they went, they overheard some passers-by say, "Look at that man riding his donkey and letting his small son walk on such a hot day." Feeling upset, the father got off the donkey and put his son on its back. Sometime later, they passed some other travelers who said, "Fancy a young, healthy boy letting his father walk on such a hot day. He must be heartless and badly brought up." Upon hearing this, both father and son rode the donkey together. After a few miles, some other people saw them and said, "What cruel, unfeeling people, both of them riding that poor little donkey." So both father and son got off the donkey and proceeded to carry it. The next passers-by saw them and said, and I leave it up to your imagination what they said. So, this is only a joke, isn't it? No, for me it's much more than that. For me it is an early and very clear definition of what I want to talk about. That there are, as it were, two realities involved. The mere perception that everybody with a normal mind would say the same thing. Yes, I saw father, son, the animal, etc., etc. And the attribution, the meaning, the significance, the value of what I see. And this is what I would most want to talk about. Now, this is only an Oriental story and a joke. But less funny is the following incident that you may already have heard me mention. Please, if so, forgive me for repeating myself. This is always my greatest fear. I'm repeating myself. But then I console myself for thinking that even somebody of the stature of Einstein, when he was invited to talk about relativity theory, very probably repeated himself. So I take the same privilege, if you don't mind. It's a story that happened towards the end of May 1989 in the Tuscan city of Grosseto. A woman who had come up from Naples had to be admitted to the local hospital in a state of acute schizophrenic disturbance. Since the local hospital didn't have the necessary services to properly treat this person, it was decided to send her back to Naples. When the people of the ambulance came and said, "Where's the Senora so-and-so?" they said, "She's in there." So they went in there, and there the patient sat on the bed, fully dressed, her handbag ready, and they said, "Senora, please come with us. We're taking you now back to Naples." At which point she again became totally psychotic. She began to resist and to scream and God knows. Oh, and especially she began to depersonalize. And don't we all know that this is a basic symptom of schizophrenia, of acute schizophrenia? So that she had to be given a tranquilizer, an injection of a tranquilizer, and then carried down to the ambulance, and off they went to Naples. Outside Rome, the ambulance was stopped by a police car and sent back to Grosseto. Why? Because there had been a mistake. The lady in the ambulance was not the patient. It was an inhabitant of Grosseto who that morning had come to visit a relative of hers who had undergone an operation. Now, what I'm trying to point out is the mistake created a reality in which every behavior of that woman, especially even the most appropriate behavior of that woman, was further evidence of her craziness. Huh? She became irrational, and she began to depersonalize, claiming to be somebody else, etc. Now, isn't that proof of craziness? Huh? Another example, also taken from the newspapers. Several years ago, in the Brazilian city of São Paulo, at the presumably very elegant riding club, the railing of the terrace had to be raised because it had already happened several times that somebody fell backwards over the railing, which was too low. An anthropologist got interested in this phenomenon, and he investigated and found something that is already known, well known, namely that in every culture there exists a correct distance that I have to take up when I talk to somebody, standing up somewhere and talking to somebody. Here in the States, in Western Europe, it is the proverbial arm's length. Huh? This is the right distance to take when I talk to somebody. In the Mediterranean countries and in Latin America, this distance is shorter. So please imagine what happened if, let's say, a North American and a Brazilian started a conversation on that terrace. The North American took up the right distance. The South American felt it was much too far away and moved up to establish the right distance. The North American went back to establish the right distance. The South American moved up. And this went on until the North American came to the railing and fell over it. Now, if we were to continue to think monadically, let's say in Freudian terms, we would have to assign a diagnosis to this man who had fallen down. It was probably his death instinct that made him commit. No, this is what I think we owe to systems theory, the beginning of realization that the patient, as I like to put it in my own thinking, the patient is the relationship. The pathology that we observe is not his or his. No, it is in the relationship. If there had been two North Americans or two South Americans, nothing would have happened, right? Already Plutarch mentions in his book Miscellanies and Essays, he gives the example of the women of Mylesia, Mylesia being a town in what is now Turkey, and he writes, a certain dreadful and monstrous distemper did seize the Milesian maids, arising from some hidden cause. It is most likely the air that had acquired some infatuating and venomous quality that did influence them to this change and alienation of mind. For all on a sudden an earnest longing for death, with furious attempts to hang themselves, did attack them, and many did accomplish it. The arguments and tears of parents and the persuasion of friends availed nothing, but they circumvented their keepers in all their contrivances and industry to prevent them, and still murdering themselves. It's this kind of and the calamity seemed to be an extraordinary divine stroke and beyond human help, until by the counsel of a wise man, he must have been the director of mental health, a wise man, a decree of the Senate was passed, enacting that those maids who hanged themselves should be carried naked through the marketplace. The passage of this law not only inhibited, but quashed their desire of slaying themselves. Note what a great argument of good nature and virtue this fear of disgrace is. For they who had not preyed upon them of the most terrible things in the world, death and pain, abide the imagination of dishonor and exposure to shame even after death. So he was evidently a brief therapist, no? There's no question about it. All right. A colleague of ours who works in Carmel got a call from a couple who wanted couples therapy. They mentioned that the reason why they wanted treatment was that in the course of the, I believe, 8 years of their marriage, the incidence of or the number of sexual intercourse had gradually decreased until for the last 6 months they hadn't had any sexual contacts. And this they considered to be somewhat pathological. They were afraid of trying to get started again because, not without reason, they assumed if they failed, it would be even more difficult to get going again. So they wanted an interview 3 weeks from the moment of this telephone call, because they were about to leave on a vacation trip. They come for their first session and explain that the problem had disappeared. How? Well, they passed one night in the guest room of a friend of theirs, somewhere in a distant city, and in this guest room, the double bed was pushed in the corner. Now, in their own bedroom, the bed was in the more traditional position like this, all right? So she always slept here on this side and he on her left. And of course, they take up the same positions again in the other bedroom. And sometime in the course of the night, the husband has to get out. He tries to get out in his usual way, bumps against the wall, realizes where he is, and begins to leave the bed by climbing over his wife. At which moment, in his own words, he realizes that there was something of value there. And they had intercourse, which then continued on a normal frequency. Please don't ask me what that is. And so you see, I don't think any one of us brief therapists would have had the idea of telling this couple, you know what, push your bed into the corner and see what happens. Now, I have a fantasy that if that little green man from Mars came down and asked us, what do you earthlings do in order to solve problems? And we explained to him our fantastically complex theories about how to bring about change and so on, he would probably scratch his head or its equivalent and would ask us, why don't you start looking at the phenomenon of change without already having these complex hypotheses? And this is exactly what nobody of us has yet done, except Franz Alexander. I don't know, 45 years ago, he coined the term of the corrective emotional experience. And by this he means a chance event that occurs, as it occurs dozens of times every day in our lives, a chance event that occurs and suddenly brings about a change. This was a chance event. That wasn't planned or anything, and yet it solved the problem. So this is how change occurs millions of times every day, I assume. There are millions of people in the world. And we have never bothered to find out how does this basic, most obvious, most natural, most immediate form of change occur? No. All right. This, of course, raises a number of questions in the Orthodox minds. First of all, how about the criterion of reality adaptation? If chance events can change a person's mental health, then what about our criterion of normalcy? As you may remember, Freud postulated that the criterion of normalcy is the ability to work and to love. that had been at least within, and that presumably still is in the framework of psychodynamic theory and therapy, is still the criterion of normalcy. Except that the Freudian criterion is not quite applicable, for instance, to people like Hitler, because we all know that he worked very hard, and he loved at least his dog, if not even Eva Braun. But I think hardly anybody would call him normal. It also doesn't hold for the proverbial and well-known eccentricities of extremely gifted persons. Their behavior often is very, very strange, and yet they are geniuses. So, as you know, within the last 40, 50 years, we switched to the criterion of reality adaptation. Without bearing in mind that there's absolutely no proof that anybody knows what reality really is. The concept of reality adaptation is based on the totally unproven and unprovable idea that normal people, and especially we therapists, know how things really are, how reality really is, and our so-called patients are crazy because they see reality differently. Now, when I lived in Bombay, they introduced me to 2 or 3 swamis, swami being a holy wise man. Now, these were people to whom in the West the diagnosis of catatonic schizophrenia would have applied. There, they are considered swamis. The idea of a real reality that can be perceived by us has been questioned for the last 200-300 years. It did not prevent the Age of Enlightenment to come up with their famous 3 basic ideas, i.e., that the world is governed by rational principles. 2, that the human mind is capable of perceiving these principles. And 3, that the human will is capable of living according to these principles. You remember, as a result of this marvelous explanation of how the world really is, about 40,000 people were killed in a very rational fashion by the guillotine, and France then returned to a traditional monarchy after this, so it didn't get us very far. Anyway, as I say, the idea of a real reality existing out there objectively and accessible to the human perception and the human mind has been questioned for a long time. Epictetus already said in his work, it is not the things that bother us, but the opinions that we have about the things. Vico, the famous Giambattista Vico, the last person who allegedly still knew everything that was to be known in this world. This has become a little difficult, as you know. Vico, a man of the late Italian Renaissance, said working scientifically means putting things in a beautiful order. So working scientifically creates an order. It doesn't discover it. Okay. Vico already knew that. Schopenhauer in the Kant says, every error consists in our taking the way we determine, divide, or deduce concepts for qualities of the things in and of themselves. Schopenhauer, who was a follower of Kant, says, this is the meaning of Kant's great doctrine, that teleology is the study of evidence of design and purpose in nature, that teleology is brought into nature only by the intellect, which thus marvels at the miracle that it has created in itself in the first place. And even in mathematics, you would imagine mathematics being the most objective of all sciences. Even there, people are beginning to realize that mathematical theory is a construct. Gabriel Stolzenberg, a mathematician, once a mathematician has seen that his perception of the, in quotation marks, self-evident correctness of the law is nothing more than the equivalent of an optical illusion. Neither his practice of mathematics nor his understanding of it can ever be the same once he has seen this. In his conversation with Einstein in 1926 in Copenhagen, Einstein is supposed to have said to Schrödinger, "Every man's world picture is and always remains a construct of his mind and cannot be proved to have any other existence." So even in the area that we naively assume to be the most objective, the least contaminated by human thinking, theoretical physics, even there, the really big, really important people have come to conclusions of this sort. Heisenberg later writes on the same subject. The reality that we can talk about is never the a priori reality, but a known reality shaped by us. If with regard to this latter formulation, it is objected that, after all, there's an objective world, independent from us and our thinking, which functions or can function without our doing, and which is that which we actually mean when doing research, this objection, so convincing at first blush, must be countered by pointing out that even the expression "there is" originates in human language and cannot therefore mean something that is unrelated to our comprehension. For us, there is only the world in which the expression "there is" has meaning. And because it is itself that world picture, it is identical with the whole and therefore cannot be contained in it as part of it. I don't know whether you know Fowles's novel, The Magus. The Magus is a rich Greek who lives on the hypothetical imaginary island of an imaginary island in the Greek sea there. And his name is Conchis, and he plays away his time by totally upsetting the reality conception of the young English teachers who come from England for a year to teach English at that local school. And he comes, Fowles, the author of this novel, The Magus, comes to the core of constructivist epistemology, and when he lets Conchis explain the idea of coincidence. Nicholas, which is the English teacher, is told two dramatic stories. One about a wealthy collector whose chateau in France burns down one night with everything he possesses. The other about an obsessed farmer in Norway who has spent years as a hermit awaiting the coming of God. One night he has the vision he has been waiting for. Conchis adds that it was the very same night that the fire destroyed the chateau. Nicholas asks, "You are not suggesting," Conchis interrupts him, "I am not suggesting anything. There was no connection between the events. No connection is possible. Or rather, I am the connection. I am whatever meaning the coincidence has." And my friend Ernst von Glasersfeld, one of the main exponents of constructivism, says this is an everyday paraphrase of Einstein's revolutionary insight that in the physical world there is no simultaneity without an observer who creates it. The same Ernst von Glasersfeld then postulates in his introduction to radical constructivism that part of constructivism that may be most shocking to many, many people. And that is the claim that of the real world we can only know what it is not. And he explains this as follows, quoting from his introduction to radical constructivism. Radical, incidentally, not in the political sense, but rather in the Latin sense of going to the roots. Knowledge can now be seen as something that the organism builds up in the attempt to order the as such amorphous flow of experience by establishing repeatable experiences and relatively reliable relations between them. The possibilities of constructing such an order are determined and perpetually constrained by the preceding steps in the construction. This means that the, in quotation marks, real world manifests itself exclusively there where our constructions break down. But since we can describe and explain these breakdowns only in the very concepts that we have used to build the failing structures, this process can never yield a picture of a world which we could hold responsible for their failure. I've tried to come up with an analogy of this idea. Imagine the captain of a ship has to cross a narrow straits in a dark, stormy night. There are no navigational aids, so he has no charts. He doesn't know the straits. As you will agree, there are only two possibilities now. One is that he somehow gets through and reaches the safe open sea again on the other side. In that case, all he knows is that the course chosen by him fitted the reality of the straits, this channel. The other possibility is that he runs up against a cliff and loses his ship and his life, and in the last moment, all he knows is that the course chosen by him did not fit the reality of the straits. That's all he knows. Now, how are realities then constructed? That's what I would like to talk a little bit more about and approach a little more the clinical aspects of all of this, because this is, after all, why you are here. As the Grosseto example shows, realities are constructed by communication. What does it mean? Well, think of Piaget. Jean Piaget, in his famous book, The Construction of Reality in the Child, already points out that the socialization process of a child consists in messages that the child gets from his human environment. We are telling you who you are. We are telling you how you must see the world. That's how we gradually become normal, as one assumes. As I already pointed out at the beginning example, let me take another one. Suppose for a moment that all of us see a person who jumps into that water to save a drowning man. If we have a normally functioning central nervous system, we all are aware that this, what I just explained, has taken place. But invariably, as I already said at the beginning, invariably we attribute meaning, sense, and and significance and value to that very thing. And on that level, that I call the reality of the second order, there is no way of establishing objectively, definitely, finally, what is true. Did he jump in because he's simply an ethical person who wants to save another person? Did he jump in because he considers this kind of a deposit into his celestial bank account? Did he jump in because he knows that the drowning man is a millionaire? There is no way in which that can be established. Or take the case of let me merely say that we therefore are always up against two levels of reality. One that is transmitted to us by our sense organs, and on this level there is bound to be more or less agreement, unless I have difficulty with my eyes or ears or something. But the other level, that I call the reality of the second order, is something that on which there is no objective evidence who is right. Think again at the story of the father, the son, and the donkey. Who was right? Nobody. There are different viewpoints. To believe, therefore, that that reality is constructed forces us to see communication no longer as a transmission of objective information. Let me give you some examples. Professor Babelas, a psychologist who worked at Stanford University and is now up in Canada, invented a number of experiments. Unfortunately, he never published it. But they are very, very interesting experiments. They're called contingent reward experiments. And I'll explain to you one of those. The experimenter says to the subject, I'm going to read out to you now a long list of number pairs, of numbers, of two-digit numbers, pairs of two-digit numbers. And after every one of these number pairs, please tell me whether those two numbers fit or not. And almost invariably the subject says, wait a moment, what do you mean if they fit? And Barbara says that's precisely what you have to find out. So if you've ever been exposed to a trial and error kind of experiment in psychology, you think, oh, that's one of those. All right, so it begins. And the experimenter says, 48 and 12. Please put yourself into the position of the subject. Do those two numbers fit or not? Yes? Why, please? They are multiples, yes. Any other reason? Fun?
They sound nice together.
They sound nice. Huh? You have a very strong aesthetic perception, yes. Are even number? Both are even numbers. Anything else? Fun? Yeah, they're even numbers, yes. Yeah. But if there were seconds, well, yes. But if there were seconds together, they would make up a minute, wouldn't they? 48 plus 12 is 60. So in any case, you say they fit. And the experimenter says, wrong. Then he says, 17 and 83. Please, do they fit or no? They both add up to 100. If that isn't significant, please, I ask you, huh? Anything else that is significant in this relationship? But they're both odd numbers, you're right, because already with the even numbers we didn't have much luck, right? So odd numbers, yes. What else?
Prime numbers.
That's the most important part, I believe. They are both prime numbers, right. And as far as I know, they are the only two prime numbers that add up to 100. I mean, you have plenty of evidence that they fit, don't you? And you say, they fit. And the experimenter says, no. And this is how it goes on for a while. Until you have gradually developed, or I should rather say constructed, an idea about the reality underlying or composing this micro-universe of number pairs. And when you have reached a state in which you almost always guess correctly, it takes a long time, mind you, but gradually you have to develop a hypothesis that more and more often makes you give the right answer. At this point, the experimenter breaks off the experiment and asks you for the theory that you've developed. And you explain to him it's usually quite a complicated kind of a hypothesis. And only then does the experimenter tell you that this was a non-contingent reward experiment in Barbalas's terms. That means that between your answers and the experimenter's correct or incorrect reply that is correct or incorrect, I mean, there is absolutely no connection. The experimenter gave his right answers on the basis of a Gaussian curve, that is to say, at first almost never, and then more and more often. Say no, 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 and then gradually more and more frequently, yes, yes. By doing this, the experimenter has created in your mind a construction that refers to the meaning, or to the, not meaning, that relates to this micro-universe of number pairs. And the interesting thing is that subjects, as soon as they're given this explanation, have difficulties accepting this. Because whosoever has created with a great deal of effort and with many, many failures has gradually arrived at the point where his view of the world is correct, has great difficulty of giving up this idea. And the for me, funniest thing is that there were some of the people, quite a few, who tried to convince the experimenter that this list of numbers chosen by him had an internal order that he, the experimenter, had not perceived. So here you have a nice experimental example of creation of a reality. Yes, please.
You're saying that the motivation of the illusion of making progress
well, I'm going to come to this. It is not quite yet not quite the point yet, yes. All right, so here's this. As you know, we see colors only because we have eyes. Let's leave aside the point that even that perception of colors is a fantastically complex process of construction within our central nervous system and our brain, therefore. But let's leave that aside. But do you realize that even a small child can perceive a red light? But the child does not therefore know that this perception in English is called red, or presented by the three symbols R, E, D. And the child does not therefore also know that the appearance of this red light under certain circumstances means you must not cross the street now. No? So we see colors only because we have eyes. And the meaning attributed to those colors can change enormously from one culture to another. A $20 banknote is a piece of paper with various colors on it. The value of this piece of paper is presumably a small fraction of a cent. But we all have agreed that this piece of paper is worth $20, which is totally imaginary. It's a construction. It is in no way the first order reality of this piece of paper. No, it is a second order reality. It is a meaning that we have attributed to and all agreed upon the value of this piece of paper. What I'm trying to explain is best expressed by the well-known joke, what is the difference between an optimist and a pessimist? And you may know the answer, don't you? The optimist says of a bottle that it is half full, and the pessimist says of the same bottle, of the same reality of the first order, that it is half empty. Now try to figure out who of the two is right. They agree only on the level of the first order reality, but evidently they live in two very different worlds. And so in the process of communication between people, there can be constantly problems of a very serious nature. Because the nature of a relationship is something for which there are no objective proofs. The way I see my relationship to my partner can be very different from the way my partner sees it. And there is no way of proving that one is right and the other is wrong. There are only two separate realities of the second order. And out of the discrepancies and contradictions arise the problems that we are trying to deal with in our work. So I repeat something I said from the very beginning. For us, for me, I should say, and I don't know how many of my colleagues share this point of view, for me, the patient is the relationship, is the clash between two second-order realities. There are, of course, other possibilities that something can go wrong in a relationship, and then can be given a different meaning. For instance, imagine that A writes a letter to B inviting B to participate in a particular project. B is delighted, he wants to participate, he immediately writes a letter to A saying that yes, he wants to participate, but postal service being what it is, the letter gets lost. So now they're both sitting there waiting for the other's answer. And they have no reason to repeat the thing. They know that the other ought to answer me, and they find it very, very annoying and impolite for the other to ignore my letter. Who is wrong? There is a story that I have invented for my own education, and that is, imagine that two nuclear physicists have a conversation. And the one says to the other, an atom of uranium has 92 electrons. what do you think the answer of the other end is going to be? Just imagine that you are the other physicist. What are you going to say? Nothing? Pardon? No, I mean it's a well-known fact that uranium has 92 electrons. So the answer is yes, all right? May I so? Yeah. No, I don't think so. In my fantasy, the answer is, do you think I'm an idiot? I have studied nuclear physics too. For the other, the mere statement of a fact, of a first order reality, is offensive. It implies that I am an idiot. Huh? You see that this has nothing to do with atoms. Huh? So when we try and deal with human problems, we always are up against these two levels. On the relationship level, on the content level, as Gregory Bateson called it, we exchange information that can be objective information, like the number of electrons. On the relationship level, as Bateson calls it, we are giving the other invariably, whether we try it or not, it doesn't matter, invariably on the relationship level, we give a definition of the way we see the relationship with the other person. And this is where human conflict can arise and does arise. The way the human environment of a so-called patient reacts to the patient's complaint is another classical example. We already talked about in various workshops about the attempted solution as a very important piece of information that we need in order to make our intervention. And for me, it is a very interesting form of reality construction. Take, for instance, depression. Almost invariably, the human environment of the depressed patient tries to change his reality by encouragement. Come on, it's not so bad. Look, the sun is shining. Pull yourself together a little bit. You will see. Huh? If you've ever been depressed only a little bit, you know what this kind of help does to you. You go deeper and longer into depression. Because to you it means that either they don't understand the depth of my suffering, or what are you talking about? Huh? If I may repeat this example, you may have heard, if I had been born in this country, I would have great difficulty going to school. Because in this country, as you know, even in the preschool age already, it is drummed into children's head. School is fun. But for me, school never was fun. So had I been born in this country, I would have arrived at the conclusion there's something deeply wrong with me. Because for me, school is awful. Huh? Fortunately, I had two very, very conservative, traditional parents, and they very nicely listened to me, very, very understandingly listened to me and said, yes, you're absolutely right. School is awful. And examinations are even worse. Huh? You're quite right. But you go. And that did it. So, the attempted solution creates, to my mind, in most of the cases, we can observe that the attempted solution is the very thing that causes or is the pathology that we're trying to treat. There is a very, to my mind, a very charming French story about the attempted solution, even though it isn't called that way. A couple by the name of Machin have desire nothing more than to have a child. The years pass and their wish is not fulfilled. Eventually, when they have almost given up hope, the desired thing happens. She is pregnant, she becomes pregnant, and in due course gives birth to a little boy. Their delight is indescribable, and they want that the name of the child reflect the marvelous nature of this event. And after long pondering, they decide to call the child Formidable. not only is the name in and by itself a bit stupid, but the child unfortunately grows up and remains rather small and thin, and for all his life he's the target of monotonous, stupid jokes that all relate to the difference between his name and his constitution. When he is on his deathbed, he says to his wife, "I have put up with this idiotic name for all my life, but I don't want it perpetuated on my gravestone. You write what you want, but don't mention my name." She promises, he dies, and after long thinking, she orders a gravestone on which you can read, "Here lies a man here lies a husband who has always been a loving, considerate, and charming man," or something similar, right? Whoever passes the grave and reads the inscription says, "Tiens, c'est formidable." You see, now, how do we arrive at such strange kinds of definitions of reality? Let me show you an example that I find very useful. It was certainly useful for my understanding of what can be done and what brief therapy can utilize. And it is, those of you who know it, please don't say it yet. I would like the people who don't know it yet to try it out first. It is the task to connect these 9 dots that are arranged in form of a square, to connect these 9 dots by means of 4 straight lines without lifting the pen off the paper. I have yet to find somebody who can solve this problem by himself. And I, of course, couldn't. No? I sat there and I thought, 4 lines, let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, it leaves 1 point unconnected. Then I thought, it has to be diagonally, obviously. 1, 2, 3, 4, that leaves 2 points unconnected. As I say, this to me is a symbol of the kind of a predicament we find ourselves in many, many times in our lives. The problem is, as you will see in a second, the problem is that we have imposed on ourselves a condition for the solution of this problem that the problem does not contain. For some very odd reason, whoever tries to solve this problem imposes on him herself the idea that the solution has to be found within the square presented by those 9 dots. This isn't the case. Therefore, the solution is very, very simple. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, I think you will agree. It's a symbol of the problem we find ourselves in life many, many times. And I think you will agree that it would help me nothing if I were to try and analyze the reason why I have imposed on myself this limitation. What in my past has brought about this blindness? What kind of an experience? There's something my mother did when I was 3 years old, or something like this. No. Look, then also that all you have to do is to tell the person, go outside the square. Don't allow yourself don't get yourself caught up inside the square. But that's what we all are doing in our lives, constantly. And then some chance event, precisely what Franz Alexander called a corrective emotional experience, may occur, and suddenly, of course, this is how it goes. And I thought I have to go in this direction, and I couldn't go. So this for me is the essence of brief therapy. This for me is the essence of bringing about a change. Of telling the person, do such and such, And if you manage to convince the person to do such and such, which is not easy, as we all know, then suddenly the problem is gone. As you know, our power to get ourselves caught is remarkable. I heard a story by a lay hypnotist who is really very, very appreciated for his work. He's very often called by doctors, physicians to come and do a hypnosis under their supervision with a particular patient. So one day he's invited by one of the physicians to come to that doctor's house and give a demonstration and a talk to a number of colleagues of this physician. So he arrives at the house, and as he walks into the place, into the room where he was supposed to give his presentation, he notices in his own words, every horizontal surface was filled with vases with freshly cut flowers. And he has a horrible allergy to freshly cut flowers. And he already begins to feel the burning in the eyes and the watering of his nose. And he says to the person who has invited him, he says, listen, I don't think that under these circumstances I can give my presentation. I have this horrible allergy. And the doctor says, that's very funny because these are all plastic flowers. So he goes over and checks one, and oh yeah, plastic. And the moment he has realized this, he begins to feel that his allergy goes away. Now, you see, that to me is the essence of what we are trying to do in brief therapy. I myself, I hope you don't mind my relating to myself, had a similar experience. I had given a seminar, two-day seminar, south of Dublin, on a bay of a beauty that I had not expected. I mean, it is just, I didn't know Ireland was that beautiful. You looked out over the bay and the setting sun and the clouds, and it was just, it was a landscape of Mediterranean beauty. And I was tired, from the long flight over from San Francisco and the 2 days of work and so on. So I sat there rather pleased but tired and enjoyed the beauty. And then suddenly, behind me, a noise begins. Some idiot is playing soccer with an empty beer can. And I think why on earth? This happens to me all the time. When I have a moment of this beautiful feeling of oneness with nature and of relaxation, and some idiot comes with his transistor radio and produces acoustic stench, or begins to play soccer with an empty beer can, the noise goes on, and I turn around to kill the man with my looks. And what is it? It's a dog playing with the beer can. And I've never seen a dog play, with such delight. And doing it, and he was fantastic, he threw it up into the air and then ran after it and so on. And I'm crazy, what animals are concerned, So I got delighted. My mood switched within a second from anger and bitterness to delight. And eventually my leg started to hurt, so I turned back around and looked back over the sea. The noise kept going on, but now it was part of my harmony. So can you see how things can change very, very immediately, and in ways that we better learn to apply consciously? Well, the best known examples of such sudden changes and improvements are self-fulfilling prophecies and reframing. You may remember that, those of you who live in California may remember that in 1979, I think, the mass media announced immediate shortage of gasoline, that the gasoline supply to the state of California would be drastically reduced as a result of the difficulties in the Middle East. And you may remember that we, the 12 or 15 millions of the car owners in California, went immediately to fill up our tanks. Now, the filling up of 15 million gas tanks that until that moment were probably only half empty, overnight caused the shortage that had been predicted. So the self-fulfilling prophecy, therefore, is, in the self-fulfilling prophecy, the prophecy of the event leads to the event of the prophecy. An assumption about something that will happen in the future makes me act in a way that produces the very thing that I assume will happen in the near future. I understand that years before this incident, there was a television show. I don't watch television, but there was a television show in Los Angeles every Sunday night, and it was a very funny one, and allegedly the man in charge of this show one Sunday night mentioned that there was an imminent shortage of toilet paper. And it was shown that on the following morning, thousands and thousands of people ran to the supermarkets and bought up toilet paper, entire huge cartons of it, thereby producing within a few hours the very event that this man, as a mere joke, had predicted. So we see how these assumptions create realities, create first-order realities. And this is, to my mind, is so important for our brief fair-bit work. In the old days, what do you call somebody who used to counsel people to get together for marriage? There's a name for it. What?
Matchmaker?
Matchmakers. Thank you. It's left my. As a result of my increasingly close collaboration with Professor Alzheimer, I had a matchmaker. In the good old days, matchmakers would proceed in very similar ways. You know that in the good old days, families, 200 years ago and 100 years ago maybe, families were interested in bringing about a marriage between their child and another child, son or daughter of the other family, which wasn't necessarily what those two people themselves wanted. But the matchmaker created an interest in the other person by telling both persons separately, have you noticed how interested so-and-so is in you? Every time you don't look, he or she looks at you with great interest. So they both began to look at each other, and that was the matchmaker's task. Well, let me be brief, and what time do I finish? Does anybody remember what my... 3. At 3 it is now, what? 1? A quarter? To 3, oh. Then let me be a little briefer. In order to bring about these kind of changes, and in order to make direct interventions, in order to get people to behave differently from the way they behaved so far, to overcome their attempted solution, the classical language of science is no longer applicable. The classical language of science in linguistics is called indicative. It is the language of description, explanation, and in our field especially interpretation. And for a long time, apparently there was only this kind of language of science. What else could there be? In fact, the famous logician and mathematician Poincaré said precisely this. A scientist will never arrive at a proposition that says do this or don't do that. 60 years later, an Englishman by the name of Stafford Beer, in a very, very interesting book, the laws of form without the came up with a very different interpretation of the language of science. It's a book that I have read many, many times. I always stopped at page number 2 because it is simply too abstract for me. But I can read the footnotes and I can read the appendices, and in one of them he proposes that there is another language too, not only the language of explanation and description and interpretation, but there is also the language of that what he calls the injunctive language, the language of injunction, the language that does precisely that which Poincaré said it cannot do, i.e. it prescribes, it gives orders, it says do this, don't do that. And Beer says precisely that this injunctive language plays a much greater role in science than we are prepared to admit, most of us. He says the training of a scientist does not so much consist in reading the right books and writing papers, but rather in following injunctions, just like look down that microscope. Having looked down that microscope, having followed the injunction, the scientist then sees something that otherwise he would not have known that it existed. And Stafford Beer says that the same goes for many other human activities, even cooking. He says the taste of a cake may not be communicable in that indicative language. You can say, well, it tastes a little bit of chocolate and there's a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but it is much better and you get the person much more quickly to have this new experience by telling the person take a pound of flour and so much chocolate and so much almonds and do this and do that, and then put it into the oven and then taste it and you will know. He says also music is a similar art form. The musician does not try to explain in indicative language what kind of feelings he was trying to put into his composition. But he produces a set of instructions, the notes. If you follow this, if you play this, then you have a direct experience of what the composer experienced. So, this injunctive language, of course, is the language of brief therapy, as I see it at least. It is not the language of interpretation anymore. It is a language that says, go and do such and such, which of course may be very, very difficult, and that brings me to my last point on my list here, and that is that for me, the most important training I got after Jungian analysis and teaching psychoanalysis and when I was a professor of psychotherapy in Latin America, and then working as a research associate at Temple University in Philadelphia, Department of Psychiatry, and so on and so on. For me, the most important thing was learning hypnosis. Because if you learn hypnosis, you learn a number of things that can be applied also outside hypnosis, outside the trance. And it is especially the use of language, how to motivate people, how to get people to try that direction rather than this direction that they have been going, the attempted solution. And one of the most important aspects of this kind of language, of this kind of therapeutic procedure is to learn and speak the client's language. This is exactly the opposite of what we do in classical therapy. In classical therapy, we spend months to teach the client a new language, the language of the particular school I belong to. And this takes a long time. And only after the client has learned this new language and has begun to see himself and his life and his difficulties in terms of this new language is changed and attempted. I repeat, it takes a long time. In brief therapy, we do the opposite. In hypnosis especially, we do the opposite. Before inducing the trance, we listen very carefully to the way this person talks. And we find out whether this person is, for instance, a visual type, or if he's a proprioceptive type. Bandler and Grinder call it something else. What is it? Kinesthetic type. If I try to give visual suggestions to a person who is kinesthetic, the person is likely to come out of the trance by saying, it feels marvelous, but of all the things you said, all those images you mentioned, I didn't see a single one. So you have to listen. When you do hypnosis, you listen. How does this person, what kind of information is contained in the language the person uses? I can't see this. Or this opened my eyes. Or if you ask the person, kind of a person is your mother, he gives you an almost photographic description of his mother. Then you know you're up against a visual type. Persons who say this gives me the creeps, or it sticks in my throat, or it really makes me feel ill, or something like this. This is the language of a proprioceptive, kinesthetic type. So this is what we learn very quickly in hypnosis. It's a precondition for successful hypnosis. But the same thing holds outside trance. If we listen carefully to what our so-called patients are telling us, we can begin to understand in what kind of reality they live, what kind of reality they have constructed for themselves. And we then use that language. The most obvious example that I remember again and again and again is the mother who is dealing with her, let's say, 17-year-old son as if he were still 6 years old. Everybody has told this woman, stop spoiling him. He has to become independent. He has to become responsible. And even if it requires falling on his nose occasionally, it hurts, yes, but it is necessary. You cannot for the rest of his life be his consciousness and his alarm clock and so on and so on. This woman only speaks and understands the language of maternal sacrifice. Therefore, I'm going to talk to her in that language. Mrs. So-and-so, you have already made great sacrifices to help your son. I am afraid that even greater sacrifices will now be necessary. And now she listens to me. So that is one of the preconditions of giving successful behavior prescriptions. And then, one connected with this, one last remark. Another thing we learn very quickly in hypnosis is the avoidance of negations, of N words in English. No, not, no, nowhere, nobody, never. For a quite plausible paleolinguistic hypothesis, on the strength of this hypothesis, negation entered the human language, digital language that we are using relatively late, which may be the reason why in so-called states of regression we are not capable of registering negation. When I do work, for instance, with people who have just been clients of mine who have undergone an operation, then we prepare the client for the operation, and then I promise I will be there in the recovery room. Person comes into the recovery room still under complete anesthesia, and I then begin, but knows that I'm going to be there, and they are virtually in a state of profound trance. And I then begin to speak to them, give them suggestions. One suggestion, for instance, if there's a danger that as a result of this anesthesia he may begin to feel nauseated and has to vomit. And if you have an abdominal operation, this vomiting must be, I assume, very painful. I do not say to that person, I do not suggest to that person, you will not feel nauseated, because it means for him, it means you will feel nauseated. No, I put the same thing in a positive sense. An hour after you return to your room, you will have a pleasant sensation of appetite. And you will ask the nurse to give you a glass of orange juice. Now, I've said the same thing, but in totally positive terms. Educators know the same thing. They know that if you tell the child, don't forget to mail this letter on your way to school, the child is much more likely to forget than if you say, remember to mail this letter. Anyway, let me stop here because we only have a very few minutes for our conversation. Please feel free. Unless I have eliminated the last clarities. So everything is completely clear. All right, in that case, let me mention one more technique taken from hypnosis. You may have been up against people who somehow know everything already. Everything that you are going to say, and why you are going to say it, and what purpose, for what purpose, and in what direction this is supposed to go. So they are constantly trying to be 1 yard ahead of you, and you want them to shut up. So Erickson has developed a beautiful technique that he called the confusion technique. He began to talk about something totally trivial in a tone as if this were something of the greatest importance. There's a deep meaning. Do you remember your 14th birthday? No, of course I don't. Who remembers his 14th birthday? But do you remember that on your 14th birthday, your 13th birthday was in the past? Oh, yes, of course. And your 15th birthday was in the future. The eyes begin to be a little glassy, and the person begins to wonder, why is this great man telling me these banalities? There must be a deep, deep reason why he's doing this. And the way we are built, we human beings, when we are in a state of confusion of this sort, the first clear message that comes our way, we hold on to, like a lifesaver. You see, I am here, and you are there. My here is here, and my there is there. But for you, my there is your here, and my here is your there. Huh? Or, the word Spanish is not itself Spanish. But the word Espanol is Spanish, yes. The word Spanish is English. Well, I don't know. Is it? I can't trust my watch. What is the time? Thank you very much.